I supply the music, and David Lee Roth is the mouth, and unintentionally makes it easier to label Van Halen a truly schizophrenic rock and roll band. Hey, welcome to the Audio Mover channel. I'm Robert John Hadfield, and that is taken from the Atlanta Constitution newspaper on February 18th of 1984. And if you're a Van Halen fan, I really think you're going to enjoy what I have for you here today. So, as I was doing some research for this show, I came across this Hit Parader magazine from May of 1985. Now, this is such an interesting period in the Van Halen story. It's right as the original Van Halen is falling apart, because 4 months after this Circus magazine would have come out, in September of 1985, Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar would appear together at Farm Aid and announce to the world that they were joining forces for a new version of Van Halen. But what grabbed me about this was something completely different. And I'm going to take you on a little journey and come back full circle back to that here at the end of the video. It was this very first paragraph, though, that caught me. So check this out. When you've released your hottest album to date, taken your flashiest show ever on the road, banked more dollars than any other band for just one gig, and have the whole of America licking your palm, do you ever stop and ask yourself why? Now, that paragraph stopped me cold. Of course, they're talking about 1984, the album, and the US Festival, where they were paid $1.5 million for a single appearance. But what grabbed me was that question, why? It's a question I actually spend a lot of time asking myself when I'm researching. What makes one band take off while another just can't get off the ground? And Van Halen is fascinating in that way. Why then? Then I stumbled across this newspaper article where someone tries to answer that very question. So I'm going to share with you that article along with a couple of things from Noel Monk's book, Running with the Devil, and also a couple of things from Ted Templeman's book. And if you're a Van Halen fan, I think you're going to find this stuff fascinating. But before we jump into that, let's get into today's Audio Mover Rock Trivia Challenge. Got 3 questions about Van Halen. See how many of these things you can answer. Okay, first question. Who was Van Halen's manager prior to Noel Monk? Was it Mo Austin, Marshall Burrell, or Ted Templeman? Okay, next question. Who co-wrote the song I'll Wait, but was not credited on the record? Was it Bryan Adams, Phil Collins, or Michael McDonald? Okay, last question. David Lee Roth would release his first solo effort the following year. Who was the producer of that record? Was it Mike Stone, Mac, or Ted Templeman? Okay, pause the video, go down below in the comments, put whatever answers you think you know, and at the end of the video, we'll see how well you did. And stick around to the very, very end of the video because I'm going to tell you about this trip that I'm going to be taking to Thailand because I would love to have you join me. So to put this in context, this article we're looking at was published in February of 1984, just a month after the album 1984 came out. This is when Van Halen was on top of the rock world. But this article isn't really about the new album. It's asking a bigger question. What makes Van Halen work? And this is so great because this writer tries to explain the magic of Van Halen while the magic was still happening. Okay, let's jump into this. David Lee Roth's showmanship and Edward Van Halen's musicianship are the main ingredients in the band's chemistry. Edward Van Halen sums up the rock band that bears his family's name by saying, I supply the music, and David Lee Roth is the mouth, and unintentionally makes it easier to label Van Halen a truly schizophrenic rock and roll band. We're dealing here with a full-blown split personality and 2 hardcore retreaters from reality. Homogenized, faceless rock bands come and go. But Van Halen has a strong image because it has a well-known and disparate pair of personalities in guitarist Edward Van Halen, 27, and singer David Lee Roth, 28. So the article starts out talking about these 2 people in Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth. And it's interesting to begin there because so often the core of a great band is 2 people. You know, you get Page and Plant, Jagger and Richards, Tyler and Perry, Lennon and McCartney. You know, the list goes on. Those pairs that kind of define the sound of their bands. But what's really fascinating here is that Eddie and Dave aren't just 2 strong musicians and performers. The article actually refers to them as a disparate pair, and that's rarely the case with those other duos. Here, it's almost like the friction is what matters. And it's not just friction of 2 guys who can't get along. That's normal with any duo. It's more like 2 guys pulling in different directions. And that friction, that tension, honestly might be the key to understanding why Van Halen worked the way it did. In his book, Running with the Devil, Noel Monk Monk gave some interesting insight about David and Eddie's relationship. Noel Monk was their longtime manager and toured with them for years. And so I want to show you this. Okay, so Noel is talking about David Lee Roth here, and he says, he told me on numerous occasions, and I quote, that he was going to be famous. He wasn't just saying it, he was declaring it. I was destined to be famous. And then over on the next page, for Edward, the music always came first. Stardom was simply a part of the deal. I always got the sense that Edward had a purity of purpose. Okay, now jumping over here, more about David. When it came to career aspirations, David was nothing if not pragmatic. He wanted nothing less than to be famous, and he knew exactly what it would take to get him there. And that something was Edward Van Halen. Okay, jumping down. David was smart. He understood that in order to make his dream come true, he would need someone extraordinarily talented on his team, and he knew that Edward, with his natural gift and obsessive dedication to cultivating it, was already on an upward trajectory toward fame. David responded accordingly by doing whatever he could to be a part of Edward's musical vision, and by magnifying his own strengths, charisma, a strong sense of humor, and a personal brand of creativity. They were friends, partners, rivals, and they inspired and infuriated each other. Okay, getting back to the article. Edward Van Halen thinks life should be lived unobtrusively in a recording studio. David Lee Roth thinks life should be lived flat out in front of as many screaming fans as can be jammed into a concert hall. Edward Van Halen likes to tinker with guitars. David Lee Roth likes to tamper with minds. Edward Van Halen's roots are in classical music. David Lee Roth's roots are in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The amazing thing is the way brother Alex Van Halen, the band's drummer, and Michael Anthony, its bassist, helped the two extremists blend their talents to make Van Halen one of the most popular bands live and on record. So here's something fun I noticed. I don't think they intended this, but look at the Van Halen logo. We see a V, we see an H, we think we're looking at two things, but that's not actually right. We're actually looking at four things. We have two letters and two wings. One wing leaning to the left, one wing leaning to the right. It's a simple principle that goes without saying, but if you only have one wing, the bird won't fly. You need two. And they have to be on opposite sides, balancing each other. And with two healthy wings, you can fly. Now, there's no way they intended it when they made this logo, but you could say that these two wings are Eddie and Dave. And like the article says, the other two guys allow the two to blend. Eddie would have been perfectly happy spending the rest of his life in the studio just making music. David Lee Roth needed the audience. He needed attention and fame. And it's that exact contrast, those powerful forces on each side, that created flight. The wings in that original logo say it all. Back to the article. To get a hint of how the process works, consider the creation of Jump, the single that is number 2 on Billboard's top 40 list, while 1984, the band's 6th album from which it came, is number 3. I was watching the news one evening and there was a fellow on top of the Arco Towers in LA and he was going to check out early, says Roth, a fast-talking blonde. There was this large crowd standing around saying, "No, no." It occurred to me, there's always one person in the crowd who says, "Go ahead, jump." I jotted it down on the back of an envelope. Now, this story gets told in different ways. Ted Templeman in his book originally thought that David Lee Roth was pushing something negative like that, but apparently David Lee Roth told him that's not what it was about. The song is about going for it, taking a risk. And whatever side you land on, that tension is fascinating. It's like the same push and pull we were just talking about. Two opposite ways of seeing the world, colliding in the same song. There you are in the song Jump. You can hear it as reckless, you can hear it as liberating. Both reads are valid, and the tension between them makes it interesting. Look in any crowd. Somebody's always saying, don't do it, and somebody else is saying, do it. That balance, that yin and yang, that's part of the human condition, and it's baked into the chemistry of Van Halen. Okay, back to the article. As recorded, however, Jump is a fairly positive song, one that says it's okay to take chances and enjoy life, so Roth's story may or may not be true. He is given to showmanship on and off the stage and isn't the sort of entertainer who's going to let facts get in the way of giving an interviewer a good story. Edward Van Halen's account of the song's creation is a bit different. I do write all the music, I will take credit for that, he says. Dave does the lyrics in the same way he does most of the interviews. Here again, we see another example of the balance in the personalities, the two wings, if you will. One guy's writing the music, the other's writing the lyrics. The studio brain and the Livewire frontman. One guy who didn't care about being a rock star, and the other guy who that's all he wanted to be. This point is really driven home by something in Noel Monk's book. He talks about one particularly delicate interaction he had with Eddie on their first tour. Eddie was particularly down one day, and Noel talked to him about what the problem was. So check this out. "I want to go back to LA, he said, his breath catching on every word. I don't want to do this anymore. My initial inclination was to shout some sense into Edward. Are you effing kidding me? Every aspiring guitar player in the world wants to trade places with you right now. You have the world by the balls, young man." And then Eddie goes on and says, "Effing David, that asshole, he wants to be a big rock star." "Well, yes, he does," I said, "but that's kind of the point of the whole thing, isn't it?" And then Eddie says, "No, not for me. I don't want to be a rock star. I hate this. I just want to go home and play jazz and funk. I just want to noodle around." Van Halen is a democracy. We vote on everything. Edward Van Halen says in a weekend telephone call from Los Angeles. "I wrote Jump 2 years ago and the majority judged it wasn't suitable for Van Halen. I got outvoted. But 2 years later, they said Jump is a good song and we should record it." Additional evidence of the schizophrenic nature of Van Halen can be seen every time the band performs. Roth, who could be used to clone sinfully handsome singers, roars on stage, threatening to wreck it, himself and the standards of decency. "A lot of bands wait for the audience to give a spark," Roth says. "I go on stage with a flamethrower." Now, this is probably my favorite line in this entire article. Some of you know that I used to be a professional musician, and I've spent a lot of time on stage in a band and as an actor. I'm also nobody important, just so we're clear. But early on in my career, though, I would hear people say things like, "Well, we had a bad crowd," or "We had a great crowd." And for a while, I just went along with that idea. I probably said it a few times myself, "Yeah, bad crowd." But then it hit me. Wait a minute. Why do we blame our success or failure on the crowd? It's not their job to be good or bad. It's my job to bring them with me. That's the role of an entertainer. Every crowd has the potential to be a so-called good crowd. The job of an entertainer is to make that happen, not wait for them to do it for us. It's the entertainer's job to control the energy, not be pushed around by it. And it occurred to me that most audiences want you to succeed. They bought the ticket. They don't want to be bored. You know, in a way, even the guy at the bar who is annoyed at your band is still rooting for you. He doesn't want to hate being there. Of course, when you're a nobody, that's when this job is the hardest, but it's still the job. So when you hear this line from David Lee Roth, it's obvious that he understood that principle, and it's part of what made him great. His job in Van Halen was to hit the stage with a flamethrower. Waiting around for the audience to save the night is a trap, and David Lee Roth had the personality or charisma or X factor that made it work as good as anyone else. And here's something really interesting from Ted Templeman's book, when he talks about seeing Van Halen for the first time. Now check this out. "One thing hit me before the show even started. They hadn't drawn a crowd. The Starwood was almost empty. But when Van Halen came on stage, it was like they were shot out of a cannon. Their energy wowed me, especially because they performed like they were playing an arena and not a small Hollywood club," which, by the way, like he said, was empty. David understood the job. Don't let the crowd, or lack thereof, control you. While Roth is singing and strutting, Edward Van Halen is demonstrating comparatively calmly why he has few peers among rock and roll guitarists. His parents forced him to study classical piano while a youngster in his native Amsterdam, but he taught himself guitar by duplicating the recorded playing of Eric Clapton, who's still his hero, and the Dave Clark Five. Now, because he mentions Eric Clapton here, there's something super endearing from Ted Templeman's book. Now, if you didn't know, Ted Templeman was Van Halen's producer all those years with David Lee Roth, and he produced a lot of other acts like the Doobie Brothers, Van Morrison, and Eric Clapton. And this is from his book. "I remember one afternoon before we started recording with Clapton, the studio secretary told me that I had a phone call. 'Who is it?' 'Eddie Van Halen holding for you on line 1. I picked up the phone. 'Ted, it's Ed. Are you in the studio with Eric Clapton?' 'Yes.' 'Do you want to say hi?' 'Yeah.' And then suddenly he'd have second thoughts. Oh, hang on, wait a minute, I'm kind of nervous. I'd encourage Ed and then put Eric on the line. Ed was a big admirer of Clapton, so I knew he was thrilled to talk to him. Ed called a few times. He'd ask for me first, hoping to talk some more to Eric. And that is so cool because even legends are starstruck by somebody. The classical study helped a lot when I started playing the piano, he says. I got sick of the piano because I never learned how to improvise. I always had to do things by the book. I don't do anything by the book when I'm playing guitar, and if I'd take lessons, I wouldn't be able to play the guitar as well as I do. Teachers go by the book. They don't teach you how to be creative. Today, he's one of the most creative guitarists in the business. He can play notes as clear as a bell, or he can ring enough feedback or other effects from whatever guitar he's playing to set other musicians to copying him. The only thing I take pride in is being different, and the fact a lot of players do a lot of the things I've come up with, he says. Things like the way I sort of approach playing the fingerboard like a piano and my use of harmonics. Now, I started playing guitar when I was a kid, long before YouTube, obviously. So the first time somebody showed me a hammer-on, finger tapping, kind of blew my mind. Like, wait, you can do that? And of course, Eddie would be the first to tell you he was just building on what he'd seen others do. And over time, it was taken to extremes, like Stanley Jordan, for example, making entire albums with nothing but that technique. Anyway, hammer-ons became a big part of the conversation with Eddie Van Halen. But another piece that doesn't get talked about as much is, like they said there, harmonics. I remember asking my guitar teacher to teach me Panama after 1984 came out. And I remember him noting the harmonics he switched to at the end of the intro. It was kind of unnecessary probably, but it added a whole new tone and energy. And Dance the Night Away is another example. Wouldn't be the same if it wasn't played with the harmonics. And Eddie Van Halen wove them into songs in a way that felt effortless. So when we talk about Eddie's innovation, sure, the hammer-ons get the spotlight, but those harmonics are a huge part of his vocabulary too. I can't say no one's ever done these things before, but I don't think anyone has taken it to the extent I have with the style guitar I use, which is pretty basic with one pickup and a vibrato bar, which causes tone fluctuations. Edward Van Halen, who cannibalized a number of guitars to create the one he used on the band's first album in 1978, soon found his modifications being copied by manufacturers. I always like to turn the corner on people when they start latching onto what I'm doing, he says. I like to be different. Of course, he's talking about the guitar he's talking about is known as the Frankenstrat. And one of the things you learn about Eddie Van Halen from his friends like Stephen Pearcy, for example, is that Eddie was a tinkerer. Not only did he love playing the guitar, he loved working on the guitar. He was a true guitar nerd in every sense. You could even pick that up by the fact that he has a Charvel logo right there on the guitar that he has inside Van Halen 2. Because that was, at the time, the home of guitar customization and tinkering back then, and he was in the middle of that world. That approach may help some hotel understand why it recently lost the cover of a room service food cart. I just took that lid type thing they flip up off the cart and put it on my guitar, he says. I flip it up and the guitar leans and is more horizontal and not just hanging down. It's sitting flat, so playing the guitar is like sitting down and having the guitar flat on my lap. It enables me to play the whole fingerboard with all my fingers while I'm standing up. It's really like playing a piano. But while Edward Van Halen is putting together guitars and getting the most he possibly can out of them, Roth seems to be tearing apart his body while getting the most he can out of it. Rock and roll, he says, is a contact sport. And of course, anyone who remembers Van Halen from that time period knows exactly what he's talking about here. Now, whether you liked his jumps, kicks, or pirouettes, there was no question you were looking at a man who was in excellent physical condition. And you could tell he thought it was a contact sport, like he says here. Noel Monk has a funny anecdote about this in his book. You'll have to check this out. Almost every day, I would have to make a personal visit to David and coax him down to the lobby. I'd walk into his room and his gear would be scattered about the floor. He'd be sitting in a chair, half dressed, watching TV, pulling on a joint, acting like he was in the middle of a week-long stay. David, what the F are you doing? I'd say. Let's move. He'd sort of roll his head, stretch a little, let out a groan or two, generally behaving like an arthritic old man. In fact, David was easily the fittest and most athletic member of the band. But on getaway day, he always behaved like a boxer who'd gone 12 rounds the night before. Man, I don't feel good, he'd say. What's the problem exactly? I tried to indulge him for a few minutes, but no longer. I figured he was just being lazy. Not sure, man. Everything just hurts. Maybe I'm coming down with something. Okay, well, try coming down with your bags because we're out of here in 10 minutes with or without you. Now, Noel concluded in his book that had actually nothing to do with his physical condition. It was that he had a serious fear of flying. And apparently this always happened before heading to an airport. His exuberant, energetic approach has given him a list of frequent injuries, some of which are so fluky they can be compared only to musician David Crosby's explanation that he wrecked his car and broke his wrist in 1973 because he was watching a Los Angeles police car in his rearview mirror. Roth, however, has no use for what's behind him. When you drive, he says, you follow the hood ornament. The rearview mirror is only good for seeing how good you look while you're getting there. I love that line. It is so David Lee Roth. But it's also a fascinating idea. Always look ahead and have something to focus on. His most celebrated injury was caused by one of the spinning mirrored globes favored by rock bands. Roth, who has passed out on stage on several occasions, was performing during a television taping in a nightclub in Rome, Italy, when a globe was lowered over the stage during a blackout between numbers. Then, just as they turned the lights on and started the cameras rolling, I go, 1, 2, 3, and take off for the sky. You know how when you realize an accident is inevitable, everything seems to go into slow motion? I saw it coming so well that it was like the mirror ball said, "Hey face," and my face said, "Hey ball," all of which is to say, I broke my nose. Such incidents have only added to the allure of Van Halen, which has sold more than 1 million copies of each of its first 5 albums and seldom does a concert that doesn't sell out. And there is so much truth to that being part of the allure of Van Halen, because even though David Lee Roth was self-centered and arrogant to a fault, he was also self-deprecating and funny, parading his mistakes like that in front of the world and having fun with it. They've sold out every time they've played Atlanta, says a spokesman for Cellar Door, which is presenting Van Halen twice in the Omni at a time when many bands, Black Sabbath for instance, are booked into the 16,000-seat Omni and then moved to the 4,000-seat Fox Theater because of sluggish ticket sales, which is such an interesting comparison too, because only 6 years earlier, Van Halen was touring and opening for Black Sabbath. Of course, Ozzy was in the band then. At this point, it would have been on the Born Again tour with Ian Gillan as the vocalist. We have several videos about that period on this channel too. One of them has over 100,000 views now, so if you're interested in that stuff, maybe we'll put a link down in the description of the video. The basic reasons, of course, are the showmanship of Roth and the musicianship of Van Halen. So as we talk about the opposites with David and Eddie, David being the showman and Eddie being the musician, it's also interesting to note that both could actually do the other person's thing to some degree. David can play the guitar, he understood music, he could write melodies, but he left the guitar to Eddie. And Eddie could sing. He could put on a show when he needed, but he let David be the frontman. They both had overlapping skills, but chose to trust each other and focus where they were strongest. And that kind of focus and trust is a big lesson. Don't try to do everything. Do what you do best, and then let others do what they do best. That's a life lesson that transcends Van Halen, obviously. And if you've ever run your own business, one of the most important lessons you can learn: do that which only you can do and let someone else do the rest. Now, whether they were intentionally thinking that or not here, we'll never know, but the principle plays a role in success. I think we're kind of unique, Edward Van Halen says, and I don't consider us a heavy metal band. I think there's a little more brains involved in what we do. It's not just bang your heads against the wall to the beat stuff. We've always been miscategorized. I mean, listen to Van Halen. Now, this happens with a lot of bands, this mischaracterization. Back then, especially in the 70s, people would hear loud guitars, big drums, and just kind of put everything under heavy metal. And then you end up with something like Van Halen opening up for Black Sabbath on their first tour, because on paper, especially back then, loud guitars equaled metal. And I'm not saying there wasn't overlap. A lot of us love both bands. But by 1984, with songs like Jump and I'll Wait, they clearly didn't fit the heavy metal mold. It shows how once a label sticks, especially in that environment, it was kind of hard to peel it off. On top of that, the 4 people in the band are 4 different people, and we're for real. When Dave gets out there running wild and we're all wearing our funny clothes or whatever, that's what we are. We don't use smoke bombs and a lot of special effects. We just have the most sound with the most lights and a lot of personality. And Dave's not acting. That's the way he's always been. And here we have what might be another piece of the puzzle: authenticity. Audiences can smell fake, and that authenticity probably plays a role in their success as well. Edward Van Halen limits himself to a few jumps, which is why he usually wears knee pads, and some of the typical moves expected of a guitar player. Unlike the extroverted Roth, his happiness does not require the adulation of an audience. I have a studio in my backyard and I basically live there, he says. I'm obsessed with writing music and making music, and I'm starting to do other things now outside the band. He's played with Michael Jackson and others, now that they're letting me do it. So here we're talking about the Beat It story, and think about what that story reveals about the bigger picture we've been talking about here. Eddie didn't play the solo in Beat It for money. He famously didn't get paid. He did it because he loved doing the work. That's who he was. As we talk about these two opposite forces, that story alone drives home the person that Eddie Van Halen was. Someone wants him to record a solo, he rearranges part of the song, plays one of the most iconic solos ever, and doesn't even think to ask for money. I wrote actually three tunes for David Bowie's last film, and nobody knew I'd done it because it was all synthesizer stuff. By the way, I don't know anything about that. If you know anything about him writing songs for a David Bowie movie, put it down in the comments. I've been playing the piano a lot lately, and there's a chance I'll return to classical music. I don't mean it's going to be on Van Halen's next album, but I don't imagine I'll be jumping up and down and sliding around in knee pads when I'm old and gray. I'll be playing music though. You see, I don't listen to rock and roll. I'm the black sheep of the Van Halen family when it comes to what's going on out there. The last rock album I bought was one by Brand X in 1980. My favorite album right now is by a classical pianist. By the way, Brand X was a jazz fusion group. Actually, Phil Collins was in it. He'd much rather spend a quiet night listening to that with wife Valerie Bertinelli, who stars in CBS's One Day at a Time, than follow Roth down life's fast lane. I'm not unsociable, he says, but I don't go out and do things. It's tough when Valerie and I go out together. It's bodyguard time because older people recognize her from the TV show and start hitting on her, and the kids are hitting on me. The whole Star trip is one thing I didn't bargain for. I'd rather just sit around and play. I enjoy and am obsessed with music and would be playing whether anyone liked me or not. And Roth? Well, face it. If he weren't fronting Van Halen, he'd be out doing something to attract attention. The idea, he says, is not the pot of gold, but the rainbow itself. I love that. That belongs on a t-shirt. That's a good one. It's the glamour, the tinsel, the nonstop late night, endless party that is the crest of the biggest wave with spray in your face. Now, as we've talked about, the two wings in the Van Halen logo were a perfect symbol for the band at the time. You've got the two opposing forces working together and lifting each other, flying, if you will. Eddie, the meticulous musician who could have happily stayed in the studio forever, and David Lee Roth, the big personality who wanted to get that music out in front of an audience. Those two wings lifted the band into flight. But like we said at the beginning, in September of 1985, the lineup changed. Sammy Hagar became part of the group. And interestingly, the logo shifted too. Wings became rings. Now, think of this symbol there. Wings mean motion, restless energy, danger, even chaos, while a ring is stable. A ring is designed to be anchored to something solid. A ring is locked in place. It's the opposite of flight and chaos. It's grounded and even predictable. It's fascinating that the logos themselves almost tell the story of these two eras, the chaotic flight of the Roth years versus the grounded stability of the Hagar years. Now, whether one feels more Van Halen to you than the other, it's striking how the symbols themselves echo the shifts in the band. Okay, let's get back to our answers from the trivia challenge. Who was Van Halen's manager prior to Noel Monk? Was it Mo Austin, Marshall Burrell, or Ted Templeman? And the answer to that question is Marshall Burrell, who of course was Milton Berle's nephew. And would actually, somebody else you'd be familiar with that he managed later was the band Rat. Who co-wrote the song I'll Wait, but was not credited on the record? Was it Bryan Adams, Phil Collins, or Michael McDonald? Now, you could probably figure out that answer by just some of the things we said in the video, because it was, in fact, Michael McDonald. Michael McDonald, who was with the Doobie Brothers. They needed a little bit of help writing this song, so Ted Templeman, who had worked with the Doobie Brothers, called in a favor. Michael McDonald came in, helped them create the song I'll Wait, and then when the album was released, Michael McDonald looked at the liner notes, looked at the label, and his name was not there. He was not given writing credit. And it ended up straining his relationship with Ted Templeman because of that. Okay, before we get this last question, please go down below, like the video, follow the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments. Do you agree with the assessment that was made as we read this article about the opposing forces, these different personalities, these disparate personalities that made Van Halen work? Also, we want to thank Digitech for their ongoing support of the channel. Please go to digitech.com, check out all the latest gear and technology, and whenever you go to digitech.com, please do us a favor and let them know that the guys at Audio Mover sent you. All right, last question. David Lee Roth would release his first solo album the next year. And of course, that was this one right here. This was Crazy from the Heat. Who was the producer? Was it Mike Stone, Mac, or Ted Templeman? And if you look on the back here, you'll see the answer, produced by Ted Templeman. A couple of times a week, someone asks me about these strange shirts I wear, like this one, and no, I'm not trying to sell you a shirt. What I want to tell you today is way cooler. I actually pick up these shirts in Thailand, and if you followed me for a while, you know I spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia. I usually go about twice a year, and later this year, I'm heading back. And I thought, why not open this trip up to the Audio Mover community? I've actually led tour groups before when I was part of a local college. We'd go to Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Nepal, you get the idea. I know all the cool stuff, and I'd love to share this experience with a handful of you. So if you're interested in joining me on an adventure in Thailand and exploring Southeast Asia, whether it's this year or next, just shoot me an email at audiomover@gmail.com and put the word trip in the subject line. We'll send details to all those who are interested, and we'll have the exact dates for this year's trip by the beginning of August. And for you rush heads, we will actually be taking a train to Bangkok while we're there, just so you can say you've done it. I'd love to have you join me on what will be the trip of a lifetime. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.